You can address me as the fool. The simple answer soon emanated through the grand hall and dissipated into the fog. However, the voice kept resonating in Audrey's and Alger's hearts, stirring up one ripple after another. They never expected such a designation, but they felt that he was deserving of it. The designation perfectly embodied his image as someone mysterious, powerful, and bizarre. After a few seconds of silence, Audrey stood up, held up her skirt slightly and bent her knees, curtsying to Joe Minguri. Honorable Mr. Fool, would you please permit me to take the liberty of requesting you to be the witness of our trade? It's nothing. Joe Minguri's mind whirred as he answered in a way that matched his status. It's our honor, Mr. Fool. Alger stood up as well. He bent his back slightly with his right palm over his chest. Joe Minguri lowered his right palm and smiled. Continue, the both of you. Alger nodded and sat back down before looking at Audrey. If you can obtain the ghost shark's blood, get someone to send it to the Warrior and Sea Bar at Pelican Street in the White Rose Borough of Pritz Harbor. Tell the boss, Williams, that it's what the captain wants. Once I acknowledge receipt, will you be giving me an address to mail the potion formula to, or do you want me to tell it to you here directly? Audrey thought for a moment before saying with a smile, I will choose the more secure method. Let's do it here, although it's a test of my memory. Since Mr. Fool had agreed to bear witness for the trade, it also represented that there would be a similar gathering the next time. With this in mind, she suddenly turned her head as she looked at Joe Minguri with sparkling eyes. With a tone of interest, she suggested, Mr. Fool, would you mind making a few more attempts like this? Alger listened to her suggestion calmly. He was tempted by the suggestion as well. He hurriedly echoed, Mr. Fool, don't you find such gatherings interesting? Although your powers exceed our imaginations, there has to be certain domains that you don't understand or excel in. The person across me is obviously a young lady of lofty stature. I also have my unique set of experiences, insights, mediums, and resources. Perhaps there will come a day when both of us can help you complete something trivial that might be inconvenient for you. From his point of view, the fact that he had been pulled into this space without any warning or any means to resist meant that the mysterious Mr. Fool was in control. Participating in the gatherings was not necessarily something he could refuse. Therefore, it was better to reap the benefits of this encounter as much as he could to make up for his passive and disadvantaged state. The trio at the long table had different backgrounds, resources, information channels, and comprehension of the mystical domain. If they interacted and enjoyed some limited cooperation, they could produce unpredictable and immeasurable effects. The resource trade that had just been negotiated was one example. Another example would be if he wished to kill someone. He could easily request the gathering's members who did not appear to be related to him both on the surface and in reality for help. He could perfectly misdirect any investigators. A young lady of lofty stature, was my behavior and accent that obvious? Audrey stared blankly, mouth slightly agape, but she soon jolted back to her senses and nodded her head without any hesitation. Mr. Fool, I think it's a very good suggestion. As long as this gathering becomes regular, you can totally leave certain things that are inconvenient for you to us. Of course, it has to be something within our capacities. From the moment he heard the suggestion, Joe Minguri was already weighing the pros and cons. More gatherings definitely allowed him to gain more knowledge of the secrets of the Beyonders or other mysteries, a boon for his transmigration back. For example, it was likely that the potion formula would appear at the next gathering because of the spectators. Similarly, the information he gained was bound to be helpful for his present life. However, more gatherings meant it was easier to expose himself. Indeed, regardless of the world, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Joe Minguri extended his right hand again as he rapped the side of the long table with his finger gently. Considering the fact that he was in control of the gathering's summoning and dismissal, any threat of exposure was within the confines of his control. The pros clearly exceeded the cons, so Joe Minguri rapidly made a decision. He stopped his rapping as he smiled at the anticipative and perturbed gazes of the duo. I'm a person who likes a fair and equal exchange. Your help will not go unrewarded. Every Monday at 3 in the afternoon, try your best to be alone. After I make a few more attempts and figure out certain things, perhaps you can apply for a leave of absence ahead of time. You will no longer need to worry about being in inappropriate situations. This was a form of agreement to Alger's and Audrey's suggestions. Audrey had just turned 17. Having been taken care of her entire life, she had the character of a young girl. Therefore, she could not help but clench her fist and gradually pump it in front of her chest when she heard the fool's reply. Without waiting for Alger to say a word, Audrey said in excitement, her eyes glowing, then shall we give ourselves call signs? After all, we can't use our real names for conversation. Although I might not be able to deceive Mr. Fool regarding my true identity, the person opposite me poses some danger. I must not let him know who I am. Good idea, answered Joe Mingrui in a simple and relaxed manner. Audrey's mind immediately began whirring as she aired her thoughts as they came to her. You are Mr. Fool, which is derived from tarot cards. Then, as a fixed, long-term, and secretive gathering, we should be uniform in our designations. Yes, I'll also choose one from the tarot cards. Her tone slowly turned joyous. I've decided. My designation shall be Justice. It was one of the 22 major arcana tarot cards. What about you, Mr.? Audrey cheekily smiled at her partner sitting across her. Alger frowned slightly before relaxing it immediately. The Hanged Man. It was another major arcana card. Alright, then we can be considered as the founding members of the Tarot Club. Audrey was the first to blurt it out happily, only to look fearfully at the fog-concealed Joe Mingrui. Will that be alright, Mr. Fool? Joe Mingrui shook his head in amusement. You can decide on such trivial matters by yourselves. Thank you. Audrey was clearly thrilled. Following that, she looked at Alger. Mr. Hanged Man, can you repeat the address again once more? I'm afraid that my memories will fail me. No problem. Alger was very pleased with Audrey's seriousness as he repeated the address once more. After repeating it to herself silently thrice, Audrey said again in excitement, I heard that tarot cards were invented by Emperor Roselle as a game. In fact, doesn't it come equipped with the power to divine the future? No, most of the time, divination stems from oneself. Everyone has something spiritual about themselves, allowing them to attune to the spiritual world and connect to information about themselves at an even higher level. However, ordinary folks are unable to notice this, much less be able to interpret the signs they receive. This information will present itself with the help of divination tools. Let me raise a simple example: dreams and dream interpreters. Alger took a glance at Joe Mingrui and seeing no response from him, he refuted Audrey's claim. Tarot cards are, in fact, such a tool. It uses more symbolism and more logical elements to help us in conveniently and accurately interpreting the signs. Although Joe Mingrui appeared indifferent, he was actually listening very carefully. It was only at this point that his empty mind slowly became heavy as his head began to feel a throbbing pain. Got it. Audrey nodded in agreement. Following that, she emphasized, that's not what I meant. I'm not doubting the tarot cards, but I heard that Emperor Roselle had actually created another set of cards, secret and mysterious ones. They were paper cards which symbolized a particular unknown power. There was a total of 22 cards that he completed. Later on in life, he referenced them to create the 22 major arcana tarot cards which are used as a gaming tool. Was what I said correct? She looked at Joe Mingrui as though she was attempting to get an answer from the mysterious Mr. Fool. All Joe Mingrui did was smile without saying a word. He cast his gaze at the Hanged Man as though he was putting him to the test. Alger subconsciously straightened his back and said in a deep voice, that's right. It is said that Emperor Roselle had seen the blasphemy slate and that set of paper cards contained the profound mysteries of the 22 paths of the divine. 22 paths of the divine, repeated Audrey with a longing tone. At that moment, Joe Mingrui's headache intensified. He felt that his invisible connection with the crimson stars and grayish-white fog was beginning to falter. All right, that will be all for today's gathering, he said in a deep voice after making the decision immediately. By your will. Alger bowed his head respectfully. By your will. Audrey mimicked the Hanged Man. She still had many questions and thoughts, thus, she was unwilling to have it end so soon. As Joe Mingrui severed the connection, he said with a smile, let us look forward to the next gathering. The stars brightened once more as the crimson light receded like water. Just as Audrey and Alger heard Mr. Fool's words, their figures turned into a blur as they phased away. In a second, the projection shattered as the gray fog restored its silence. As for Joe Mingrui, he felt himself turning heavy rapidly. His surroundings turned fleeting as his eyes met darkness before changing into dazzling sunlight. He was still standing in the middle of his apartment. It was like a dream. What the heck was that foggy world? Who or what sort of power created the changes that just happened? Joe Mingrui sighed softly. He was completely puzzled as he walked towards the study desk as though his legs were filled with lead. He picked up the pocket watch he placed outside to determine how much time had passed. Time flowed at the same pace. Joe Mingrui made a rough judgment. After putting down his pocket watch, he found himself unable to endure the splitting headache any further. He sat on the chair and lowered his head, using his left thumb and middle finger to massage his temples. After a long while, he suddenly let out a sigh and said in Mandarin, from the looks of it, I won't be able to return anytime soon. Only the clueless could be fearless. After witnessing such a fascinating event and learning the situation regarding Beyonders and the mysterious world, Zhou Minggui no longer dared to rashly try the luck enhancement ritual using ancient Faceac or loan language. Who knew what other kinds of situation would happen? Perhaps, it would be more bizarre, horrifying, or even a living hell. At the very least, I should attempt only when I have a deep mastery of mysticism, thought Zhou Minggui helplessly. Thankfully, the so-called gathering could provide him with help. After another bout of silence, he muttered to himself with a tone of dismay, disappointment, agony, and grief, "From this moment forth, I'm Klein." Klein tried his best to refocus his solutions and plans so as to purge the negative emotions in him. Perhaps, he could learn the potion formula for Spectator from the side. The gathering that just happened sure is fascinating. People who reside in different places across the world can reduce hundreds of kilometers to just mere inches and discuss face-to-face while supplying each other's needs. Speaking of which, this does sound a little familiar. Klein was stunned for a few seconds before he burst out in laughter. Pressing against his temple, he jested under his breath, "Wasn't that a social networking platform?" Whoosh. Howling wind accompanied a downpour. The three-mast sailboat was tossed around by the crests and troughs of the incoming waves, as if it was being toyed by a giant. The crimson glow in Alger Wilson's eyes faded. He found himself still remaining on the deck and nothing appeared to have changed. Almost immediately, the quirky-shaped glass bottle in his palm shattered and the frost within melted into the rain. In seconds, there were no longer any traces left that suggested the existence of the wondrous antique. A hexagonal crystal-like snowflake emerged on Alger's palm. It then faded rapidly until it was seemingly absorbed by the flesh, vanishing completely in the process. Alger nodded his head in a hardly noticeable manner, as if he was thinking about something. He remained still and silent for a full 5 minutes. He turned around and headed for the cabin. As he was about to enter, a man who wore a similar robe embroidered with lightning patterns emerged from inside. This man, who had soft blonde hair, paused and looked at Alger. He held his right fist to his chest and said, "May the storm be with you." Alger replied with the same words and gesture. There were no emotions on his rough face, which had a well-defined structure. Alger entered the cabin after the greeting and proceeded to the captain's cabin situated at the far end of the corridor. Surprisingly, he did not encounter any sailors on the way. The whole place was as quiet as a graveyard. Behind the door to the captain's cabin, a soft brown carpet overlaid the floor. A bookshelf and a wine rack took the opposite side walls of the room. The books with their yellowish covers and wine bottles with their dark red color looked peculiar under the flickering candlelight. On the desk with the candle, there was a bottle of ink, a quill, a pair of black metallic telescope, and a sextant made of brass. Behind the desk sat a pale middle-aged man wearing a captain's hat which had a skull on it. As Alger approached him, he said menacingly, "I will not give in." "I believe you can do it," Alger said calmly, so calm that it felt like he was commenting on the weather. The man seemed to be stunned by the unexpected answer. At this very moment, Alger leaned forward slightly and suddenly dashed across the room until they were only separated by the desk. "Ha!" Alger tightened his shoulder and reached out his right hand to choke the man. Illusory fish scales appeared on the back of his hand as he crazily mustered more strength to choke the man, giving him no time to respond. Crack. Amid the crisp cracking sound, the man's eyes widened as his body was lifted up. His legs twitched furiously before they soon became motionless. His pupils began to widen as he stared aimlessly. There was a stench from between his legs as his pants gradually turned moist. While lifting the man, Alger lowered his back and strode toward the wall. Bang. He used the man as a shield and smashed forward at the wall. His extremely muscular arm was monstrous. A hole cracked open in the wooden wall, and rain poured in, accompanied by the scent of the ocean. Alger flung the man out of the cabin, straight into the giant waves that resembled mountains. The wind continued to howl in the dark as almighty nature devoured everything. Alger took out a white handkerchief and wiped his right hand carefully before throwing it into the sea as well. He stepped back and waited patiently for company. In less than 10 seconds, the blond man from before rushed in and asked, "What happened?" "The captain has escaped," Alger answered in an annoyed manner as he panted. "I didn't know he still had some of his Beyonder powers." "Damn it." The blond man cursed softly. He went up to the opening and stared into the distance. However, nothing was visible except for the waves and the rain. "Forget it, he was just extra loot," the blond man said, waving his arm. "We will still be rewarded for finding this ghost ship from the Tudor era." Even if he was a keeper of the sea, he would not have hastily dived into the sea under this weather condition. The captain will not be able to survive much longer if the storm continues. Alger said as he nodded in approval. The wooden wall was repairing itself at a discernible rate. He gazed at the wall and turned his head subconsciously towards the rudder and the sail. He was perfectly aware of what was going on behind all the wooden planks. The chief mate, the second mate, the crew, and the sailors were not present. There was no living person on board. Amidst all the emptiness, the rudder and the sail moved eerily by themselves. Alger again pictured the fool who was covered in grayish-white fog and sighed. He turned back and looked outside at the mighty waves and spoke as though in a reverie while filled with anticipation and awe. A new era has begun. Empress Borough, Backland, capital of the Lowen Kingdom. Audrey Hall pinched her cheeks in disbelief of her encounter a while ago. On the dressing table in front of her, the old bronze mirror had shattered into pieces. Audrey cast her gaze downwards and saw the swirling crimson on the back of her hand. It was like a tattoo depicting a star. The crimson gradually faded and disappeared into her skin. Only at this point in time was Audrey certain that it was not a dream. Her eyes twinkled as she grinned. She could not help but stand up before bending down to lift up the hem of her dress. She curtsied towards thin air and started dancing lively. It was the ancient elf dance, the most popular dance among royalty at the moment. She had a bright smile on her face as she moved about gracefully. Knock. Knock. Someone suddenly knocked at her bedroom door. Who is it? Audrey immediately stopped her dance and asked as she tidied her dress to look more elegant. My lady, may I come in? You should start to prepare for the ceremony, Audrey's maidservant asked from outside the door. Audrey looked into a mirror on the dressing table and quickly wiped the smile from her face, leaving only a tiny hint of a smile. She responded gently after she had ensured everything was presentable. Come in? The doorknob turned and Annie, her maidservant, pushed in. Oh, it cracked, Annie said as she instantly saw the outcome of the old bronze mirror. Audrey blinked and said slowly, yes. Susie was here just now. I am sure you know she likes to wreak havoc. Susie was a golden retriever that was not so much of a purebred. It was a gift given to her father, Count Hall, when he bought a foxhound. Nevertheless, Audrey adored it. You should train it well, Annie said as she picked up the pieces of the bronze mirror adeptly and with care, lest it hurt her mistress. As she finished tidying up, she asked Audrey with a smile, which dress do you want to put on? Audrey thought for a while and answered, I like the dress designed by Mrs. Guinea for my 17th birthday. No, you can't wear the same dress twice to a formal ceremony or others will gossip about and question the Hall family's financial ability, Annie said, shaking her head in disagreement. But I really like it. Audrey insisted in a gentle manner. You can wear it at home or when you attend an event that isn't so formal, Annie said firmly, suggesting that it was not negotiable. Then it will have to be the one with the lotus design along the sleeves given by Mr. Sades 2 days ago, Audrey said as she drew in a gasp inconspicuously, maintaining her sweet smile. You always have such a good taste, Annie said as she stepped back and shouted towards the door, the 6th dressing room. Ah, forget it, I shall fetch it myself. Maidservants began to work. The dress, accessories, footwear, hat, makeup, and hairstyle, everything had to be taken care of. When it was almost ready, Count Hall appeared at the door wearing a dark brown waistcoat. He had a hat sharing the same color as his clothes and a nice mustache. His blue eyes were filled with joy, but his loosening muscles, widening waist, and wrinkles were obviously destroying his handsome youth. The brightest jewel of Backland, it is time for our departure, Count Hall said, knocking at the door twice. Father. Stop calling me that, Audrey protested as she got up with the help of the maidservants. Well then, it's time to set off, my beautiful little princess, Count Hall said as he bent his left arm, signaling Audrey to hold his arm. Audrey shook her head slightly and said, that is for my mother, Mrs. Hall, the Countess. Then this side, Count Hall bent his right arm with a smile and said, this is for you, my greatest pride. The Royal Navy Base, Pritz Harbor, Oak Island. When Audrey took her father's arm and walked down the carriage, she was suddenly shocked by the juggernaut in front of her. In the military port not far away, there was a huge ship shimmering with metallic reflections. It did not have a sail, leaving only an observatory deck, 2 towering chimneys, and 2 turrets at the ends of the ship. It was so majestic and large that the fleet of sails nearby were like newborn dwarfs clustering around a giant. Holy Lord of Storms. Oh, my lord. An ironclad warship. Amidst the furor, Audrey was also shocked by this unprecedented miracle created by mankind. It was an ocean miracle that had never been seen before. It took a while for the aristocrats, ministers, and members of parliament to compose themselves. Then, a black spot on the sky started to grow in size until it occupied a third of the sky and entered everyone's view. The atmosphere suddenly became solemn. It was a gigantic flying machine with a beautiful streamlined design hovering in midair. The deep blue machine had airbags made of cotton which were supported by alloy structures that were strong but light. The alloy structure's bottom had openings mounted with machine guns, projectile launchers, and muzzles. The exaggerated humming noise from the ignition steam engine and the tail blades produced a symphony that left everyone amazed. The king's family arrived on their airship, exuding a lofty and indisputable authority. Two swords, each with a ruby crown at the handle, were pointing vertically down and reflected the sunlight on both sides of the cabin. They were the Sword of Judgment emblem which symbolized the Augustus family and has been passed down from the previous epoch. Audrey was not yet 18, so she had not attended the introductory ceremony, which was an event led by the Empress that marked one's debut into the backland social scene, to announce her adult status. Therefore, she could not be nearer to the airship and had to remain silent at the back to watch the entire event. Nevertheless, it did not matter to her. In fact, she was relieved that she did not need to deal with the princes. The miracle that mankind used to conquer the sky touched down gently. The first ones to step down the stairs were the handsome young guards who wore red ceremonial uniforms with white trousers. Decorated with medals, they formed two lines with rifles in hand. They were awaiting the appearances of King George III, his queen, and the prince and princess. Audrey was not new to meeting important people, so she showed no interest at all. Instead, she had her attention on the two statue-like black armored cavalry flanking the king. In this era of iron, steam, and cannons, it was surprising that there was still someone who could bear wearing full armor. The cold metallic luster and the dull black helmet conveyed solemnity and authority. Could they be the higher-order disciplinary paladins? Audrey recalled snippets of a casual conversation among adults. She was curious but did not dare go close. The ceremony commenced with the arrival of the king's family. The incumbent prime minister, Lord Aigsidnagan, went up to the front. He was a member of the Conservative Party and the second non-aristocrat to become the prime minister till this very day. He was given the title of a lord for his great contributions. Of course, Audrey knew more. The main supporter of the Conservative Party was the present Duke of Nagin, Pallas Nagin, who was the brother of Aigsid. Aigsid was a slender and almost bald 50-plus-year-old man with a sharp gaze. He surveyed the area before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you have witnessed this history-making ironclad warship. It has dimensions of 101 by 21 meters. It has an amazing port and starboard design. The armor belt is 457 millimeters thick. The displacement is 10,060 tons. There are 4 305mm main cannons, 6 rapid-fire cannons, 12 6-pound cannons, 18 6-barrel machine guns, and 4 torpedo launchers. It can reach a speed of 16 knots. It will be the real hegemon. It will conquer the seas. The crowd was roused. The mere descriptions were enough to instill fearful images in them, let alone the fact that the actual thing was right in front of them. Aigsid smiled and spoke a few more lines before saluting the king and requested, "Your Majesty, please give it a name. Since it will set sail from Pritz Harbor, it should be named the Pritz," George III responded. His expression showed his delight. The Pritz. The Pritz. The words spread from the Navy Minister and the Admiral of the Royal Navy to all the soldiers and officers on the deck. They all exclaimed in unison, "The Pritz." George III ordered the Pritz to set sail for a trial in the midst of the gun salutes and the celebratory atmosphere. Honk. Thick smoke spewed out from the chimneys. The sound from the machinery could be heard faintly beneath the sound of the ship horn. The juggernaut departed from the harbor. Everyone was shocked when the two main cannons at the ship's bow fired at an uninhabited island in its path. Boom. 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 The ground shook as dust shot up into the sky. Shock waves spread out, producing waves in the sea. Satisfied, Aigsid turned back to the crowd and announced, "From this day on, doomsday will fall on the 7 pirates who call themselves admirals and the 4 who call themselves kings. They can only shiver in fear. It is the end of their era. Only the ironclad warship will roam the seas no matter whether the pirates have the powers of the Beyonders, ghost ships, or cursed ships." Aigsid's chief secretary deliberately asked, "Can't they build their own ironclad warships?" Some of the nobles and members of parliament nodded, feeling that such a possibility could not be eliminated. Aigsid immediately smiled and shook his head slowly as he answered, "Impossible. It will never be possible. Building our ironclad warship required 3 big coal and steel amalgamators, a scale of more than 20 steel factories, 60 scientists and senior engineers from the Backland Cannon Academy and Pritz Nautical Academy, 2 royal shipyards, almost 100 factories for spare parts, an admiralty, a shipbuilding committee, a cabinet, a determined king with excellent foresight, and a great country with an annual steel production of 12 million tons. The pirates will never achieve it. Having said that, he paused and raised his arms before shouting in agitation, "Ladies and gentlemen, the era of cannons and warships has dawned upon us." After half an hour of rest, Zhou Mingrui, who now viewed himself as Klein, finally recovered. In the meantime, he found that there were now 4 black dots on the back of his hand, which happened to form a small square. These 4 black spots faded and disappeared quickly, but Klein knew that they were still hiding in his body, waiting to be awakened. 4 spots forming a square, is it in correspondence with the 4 pieces of staple food at the 4 corners of the room? Does this mean that in the future, I don't need to prepare the food and can do the ritual and chants immediately? Klein made a guess. This might seem good, but the emergence of the spots was ominous, and things that one lacked understanding of were always scary. The fact that those inexplicable Chinese divinations from Earth could produce effects here, the strange transmigration in his sleep, the mysterious murmurings that almost drove him crazy during the ritual, and the mysterious and trippy gray world whose significance he had no idea of made Klein shiver in the hot weather of June. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. He recalled this saying as he was experiencing the fear of the unknown acutely. There was in him an unprecedented and irresistible urge to make contact with the mysterious domain, to learn more and to explore the unknown. There was also a contradicting escape mentality within him compelling him to pretend nothing had happened. Intense sunlight shone through the window onto the desk. It was as if there were grains of gold sprinkled on the desk. Klein gazed at the desk, feeling as though he had come into contact with warmth and hope. He relaxed slightly, and a strong sense of fatigue washed over him. His eyelids were as heavy as lead as they kept closing themselves. It must have been the combined effect of the sleepless night and the tiring encounter. Klein shook his head and pushed himself up with the aid of the desk. He stumbled towards the double-decked bed, completely disregarding the rye bread placed at the 4 corners of the room. He fell asleep immediately after he lay down. Groan. Groan. Klein was woken up by hunger pangs. When he opened his eyes, he felt rejuvenated. There's still a slight headache. He rubbed his temples and sat up. He was so hungry that he could eat a horse. He returned to the desk while straightening his shirt. He picked up the silver fine-leaf pocket watch. Pa. The pocket watch's lid sprang open and the second hand was ticking. 12:30. I slept for 3 hours. Klein put the pocket watch back into his linen shirt pocket while swallowing. In the northern continent, there were 24 hours in a day, 60 minutes in an hour, and 60 seconds in a minute. Whether each second passed at the same rate here compared to Earth was unknown to Klein. At this moment, he could not even think of terms such as mysticism, rituals, or the grayish world. His mind was occupied by one thing: food. He would leave the thinking to after his meals. Only then could he work. Klein picked up the loaves of rye bread from the 4 corners and wiped off the minute specks of dust on it without any hesitation. He planned on making one of them his lunch. He decided to dig into the offerings because he only had 5 pence with him and there was a tradition of eating the offerings back in his hometown. After all, there was not any observable change to the bread. It was better to be frugal. Of course, the memory and habits left behind by the original Klein had also played a role. It was a huge waste to use the expensive gas only to light up the room. So, Klein took out a furnace and boiled water with it after adding some coal. He paced around as he waited. Anyone would choke eating those loaves of rye bread without water. Yikes. Life with me only for dinner is going to be dreadful. No, wait, this is already an exception. Melissa would only allow our meals to have meat twice a week if not for my upcoming interview, Klein thought as he looked around, hungry. He had nothing better to do. His eyes seemed to turn avaricious when he set his eyes on the pound of mutton in the cupboard. No, I need to wait for Melissa to eat it together, Klein thought as he shook his head and rejected the idea of cooking half of it right now. Although he often ate outside, he had still developed some basic culinary skills, owing to his living in a big city alone. His dishes were not delicious, but they were at least edible. Klein turned his body around so that the mutton would not seduce him. Then, he suddenly realized that he had also bought peas and potatoes in the morning. Potatoes. Klein immediately had an idea. He quickly turned back to the cupboard and took out 2 potatoes from a tiny pile of them. He first cleaned the potatoes in the public bathroom and then added them into a pot so they were boiled together with the water. After a while, he sprinkled into the water some yellow coarse salt from the spices container he found inside the cupboard. He waited patiently for a few minutes before lifting the pot and pouring the soup into a few cups and a bowl. He took out the potatoes with a fork and placed them on the desk at the end. Foff. He blew at the potato as he peeled it bit by bit. The fragrance of boiled potato diffused through the air. It smelled very appetizing. He salivated crazily, the heat could not deter him any longer. Klein took a bite despite having the potato only half peeled. How fragrant! It had a powdery texture and tasted sweet as he chewed. He was instantly filled with emotions and he wolfed down the 2 potatoes. He even ate some of the skin. Then, he held up the bowl and enjoyed the soup. The pinch of salt and water proved to be thirst-quenching. I really enjoyed eating potatoes this way when I was young, a filled Klein exclaimed in his head. Meanwhile, he tore off a small piece of bread and dipped it into the soup to eat it softened. Perhaps the ritual was too tiring. Klein ate 2 loaves of bread which amounted to a whole pound. Klein felt he was finally rejuvenated. He enjoyed the joy of life after he drank the soup before tidying up. Then, he took in the lustrous sunshine happily. He sat back at the desk and began planning. I can't escape. I must think of a way to come into contact with mysticism and become a beyonder as mentioned by Justice and the Hanged Man. I need to overcome the fear of the unknown. The only way now is to wait for the next gathering. I need to try listen for the formula of the spectator potion or other things related to mysticism. There are 4 more days before Monday. Before that, I need to first figure out the problem with Klein. Why did he commit suicide? What happened to him? Unable to transmigrate back and wash his hands of everything, Klein picked up the notebook that lay on the table. He wanted to find hints that could help him regain his lost memory fragments. The original Klein obviously had the habit of taking notes. He also liked to write diaries. Klein was fully aware that the cabinet that supported the desk on the right stored a whole stack of completed notebooks. The book he had began on the 10th of May matters regarding his school and mentor, as well as content pertaining to knowledge were at the beginning. 12th May Mr. Izik mentioned that the common language used by the Balam Empire in the southern continent also developed from ancient Fasak, a branch of Jadin. Why is this so? Does this mean that every sentient living being once spoke the same language? No, there has to be a mistake. According to the revelation of Evernight and the Book of Storms, giants were not the only hegemons of the world in primordial times. There were also levels, mutants, and dragons. Anyways, these are just myths and fantasies. 16th May Senior Associate Professor Cohen and Mr. Izik discussed the inevitability of the Age of Steam. Mr. Izik opined that it was just a coincidence because if it wasn't for Emperor Roselle, the northern continent would still be wielding swords like the southern continent. Mentor argued that Mr. Izik had placed too much emphasis on the contribution of an individual. He believes that with progress, even if there wasn't an Emperor Roselle, there would be an Emperor Robert. Therefore, the Age of Steam might come late, but eventually come nevertheless. I found little meaning in their discussion. I prefer discovering new things and unraveling the hidden past. Perhaps I am more suited to study archaeology than history. 29th May Welch found me and told me that he had acquired a notebook from the 4th epoch. Oh my goddess. A notebook from the 4th epoch. He didn't want to ask the archaeology department students for help, so he came to Naya and me to help him decode the contents. How can I refuse? Of course, I can only do it after my graduation defense. I can't afford diverting my attention at this stage. This caught Klein's attention. Compared to the notes about history and viewpoint disagreements, the appearance of a notebook from the 4th epoch might have led to Klein's suicide. The 4th epoch was the epoch before the present Iron Age. Its history was mysterious and incomplete. Due to the fact that very few tombs, ancient cities, and records had been found, archaeologists and historians could only refer to the ambiguous records provided by the 7 major churches that centered around their religious teachings to roughly form the original picture. They knew the existence of the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsoist Empire. Having set his sights on solving the mystery and restoring history, Klein didn't have much interest in the first 3 eras, whose roots were closer to legends. He was more interested in the 4th epoch, also known as the Age of the Gods. So Klein was concerned for his future career and thus focused on the interview. But it was all futile, Klein could not resist exclaiming. Universities were still very scarce and the majority of students were either from noble or wealthy families. As long as he did not have an extreme mindset, a commoner who had been admitted into university would have been able to build precious social connections through group discussions and networking events despite the prejudice and exclusion from the entrenched social circles. The very generous Welch McGovern was an example. He was the son of a banker from Constant City, Mid-Seashire, Lowen Kingdom. He was used to asking Naya and Klein for help because they were always in the same group for work. Without thinking further, Klein continued reading the notebook. 18th June. I have graduated. Farewell, Koi University. 19th June. I have seen the notebook. By comparing sentence structures and root words, I discovered that it is a modified form of ancient Fasak. More precisely, over the course of its 1,000-year history, the Fasak language had changed constantly, a little at a time. 20th June. We have deciphered the contents of the first page. The author was a member of a family called Antigonus. 21st June. He mentioned the Dark Emperor. This is anachronistic with regards to the time this notebook is deduced to be written. Is Professor wrong? Is Dark Emperor a common title for every emperor of the Solomon Empire? 22nd June. The Antigonus family apparently had a very high standing in the Solomon Empire. The author mentions that he was making a secret transaction with a person named Tudor. Tudor. Is it related to the Tudor dynasty? 23rd June. I am trying to restrain myself from thinking about the notebook and going to Welch's place. I need to prepare for the interview. It's very important. 24th June. Naya tells me that they have found something new. I think I need to check it out. 25th June. From the new deciphered content, the author had accepted a mission to visit the nation of the Evernites situated at the summit of the highest peak of the Hornacis mountain range. Oh my goddess. How can a nation exist at the summit of that peak which is over 6,000 meters above sea level? How do they survive? 26th June. Are these strange things real? The record ended at this point. Zhou Mingrui transmigrated in the early hours of the 28th. Which means to say that there was indeed an entry for June 27th, it's that line, everyone will die including me. Klein flipped to the page he first saw when he arrived, feeling goosebumps while he made the deduction. In order to solve the mystery of the original Klein's suicide, he thought that he should visit Welch and take a look at the ancient notebook. However, with a lot of experience from novels, movies, and TV drama series, he suspected that if they were really related, this visit would be very dangerous. Those who went investigating castles despite knowing that they were haunted served as a warning. However, he had to go since escaping would never solve the problem. It would only make things worse, until it welled over and completely drowned him. Perhaps call the police. But claiming to have committed suicide would be silly, right? Knock. Knock, knock. There was a series of quick and forceful knocks. Klein sat straight up and listened. Knock. Knock, knock. The knocks echoed through the empty hallway. Who is it? Klein was thinking about the mysterious suicide of the original owner of this body and the unknown danger he might encounter when he heard the sudden knock on the door. He subconsciously opened the drawer, took out the revolver, and asked vigilantly. The other party was quiet for 2 seconds before a slightly sharp voice, in a Waz accent, replied, "It's me, Mountbatten, it's Mountbatten." The voice paused for a moment before adding, "Police." It's Mountbatten. When Klein heard this name, he immediately thought of the owner of this name. He was the policeman in charge of the street where the apartment was located. He was a rude, brutal, hands-on man. But perhaps, only such a man could be a deterrent for alcoholics, thieves, part-time thieves, villains, and hooligans. And his unique voice was one of his trademarks. "Okay, I'll be right there," Klein responded loudly. He had planned to put the revolver back into the drawer, but thinking that he had no idea why the police was outside and that they might search the room or do other things, he cautiously ran to the stove where the flames had already been extinguished and put the revolver in it. Then he picked up the coal basket, shook a few pieces into the stove, covered the gun, and finally placed the kettle over the stove to conceal everything. After doing all of that, he tidied up his clothes and quickly approached the door and murmured, "Sorry, I just had a nap." Outside the door stood 4 policemen in black and white checkered uniforms with peaked caps. It's Mountbatten, the one with a brown beard, coughed and said to Klein, "These 3 inspectors have something to ask you." Inspectors. Klein looked at the shoulder badges of the other 3 reflexively and found that 2 of them had 3 silver hexagons and 1 had 2, both of which looked superior to Bits Mountbatten, who had only 3 chevrons. As a history student, Klein did little to no research into the ranks of police epaulets, except that Bits Mountbatten often boasted of being a senior sergeant. So these 3 are inspectors. Influenced by conversations with Benson, Welch, and his classmates, Klein had the common sense to make way and point into the room. "Please come in. How might I help you?" The leader of the 3 inspectors was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. He seemed to be able to read the mind of a person and make them fearful. His eyes were wrinkled, and the edge of his hat revealed light brown hair. He looked around the room and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know Welch McGovern?" "What's wrong with him?" Klein quivered and blurted back. "I'm the one asking the questions." The dignified middle-aged police inspector had a stern look in his eyes. The inspector next to him, also wearing 3 silver hexagons, looked at Klein and smiled gently. Don't be nervous. It's just a routine questioning. This policeman was in his 30s, with a straight nose and gray eyes that, like a lake in an ancient forest that no one visited, gave him an indescribable sense of depth. Klein took a breath and organized his words. If you mean Welch McGovern, the graduate of Coy University from Constant, then I'm sure I know him. We are classmates with the same mentor, Senior Associate Professor Quentin Cohen. In the Lone Kingdom, professor was not only a professional title, but also a position, just like the combination of professors and department deans on Earth. That meant there could only be one professor in a university's department. If an associate professor wanted to become professor, they had to wait for their superior to retire, or force out their superior with their abilities. As talents needed to be retained, the Kingdom's Higher Education Commission had added senior associate professors in the three-level system of lecturers, associate professors and professors after years of observation. This title was given to anyone with high academic achievements or with enough seniority but did not make it to the position of professor. At this point, Klein looked into the eyes of the middle-aged police inspector and thought for a second. To be honest, our relationship is quite good. During this period, I met with him and Naya frequently to interpret and discuss the fourth epic notebook that belonged to him. Inspectors, did something happen to him? Instead of answering, the middle-aged police inspector looked sideways at his gray-eyed colleague. The inspector with the peaked cap and ordinary looks replied mildly, I'm sorry, Mr. Welch has passed away. What? Despite having some hunches, Klein could not help but shout out in astonishment. Welch died just like the original owner of this body. That is a little scary. What about Naya? Klein questioned hurriedly. Ms. Naya passed away too, the gray-eyed police inspector said quite calmly. Both of them died in Mr. Welch's house. Killed. Klein had a vague guess. Perhaps it was suicide. The gray-eyed inspector shook his head. No, the scene suggests that they committed suicide. Mr. Welch hit the wall with his head many times, covering the wall with blood. Ms. Naya drowned herself in a basin. Yes, the kind used to wash your face. That's impossible. Klein's hair stood on their ends as he seemed capable of imagining the strange scene. A girl kneeling on a chair and burying her face into a basin filled with water. Her soft brown hair swaying in the wind, but her entire person remaining motionless. Welch falling to the ground and staring at the ceiling intently. His forehead in a complete blood-mangled mess, while the traces of the impact on the wall were evident with dripping of blood. The gray-eyed inspector continued, we believe so too, but the autopsy results and the situation at the scene exclude factors such as drugs and external forces. They, being Mr. Welch and Ms. Naya, showed no signs of struggling. Before Klein could speak again, he stepped into the room and asked, pretending to be casual, when was the last time you saw Mr. Welch or Ms. Naya? As he spoke, he gestured with his eyes to his colleague with two silver hexagons. He was a young police inspector and looked about the same age as Klein. With black sideburns and green pupils, he was good-looking and had a poet's romantic temperament. When he heard the question, Klein thought about it and answered it thoughtfully, it should be June 26th, we were reading a new chapter in the notes. Then, I went home to prepare for my interview on June 30th. The interview was for the history department of Tingen University. Tingen was known as the city of universities. There were two universities, Tingen and Coy, as well as technical schools, law colleges and business colleges. It was second only to Backland, the capital. As soon as he finished, he saw the young police inspector walk towards his desk in the corner of his eye and pick up the notes which resembled more of a diary. Damn. I forgot to hide it. Hey. Klein cried out. The young inspector smiled back at him, but did not stop flipping through his notes, while the gray-eyed inspector explained, this is a necessary procedure. At this time, Bits Mountbatten and the dignified middle-aged police inspectors were just watching without interrupting or assisting in the search. Where are your search warrants? Klein had intended to question them, but on second thought, the judicial system of the Lone Kingdom did not seem to have such a thing as search warrants. At least he did not know if there was one. After all, the police force had only been established for 15 or 16 years. When the original owner of this body was still a child, they were still called public security officers. Klein couldn't stop it. He watched the young inspector flip through his notes, but the gray-eyed inspector did not ask any questions. What is this strange thing? The young police inspector turned to the end of the notes and suddenly asked, and what does this mean? Everyone will die, including me. Isn't it common sense that everyone dies except for deities? Klein was prepared to quibble, but it suddenly occurred to him that he had planned to connect with the police in case of possible danger, but he had no reasons or excuses. He made a decision in less than a second. Putting his hand over his forehead, he answered painfully, I have no idea. I really have no idea. When I woke up this morning, I felt I wasn't quite right, as if I had forgotten something. It's especially true for whatever happened recently. I don't even know why I had written such a sentence. Sometimes, being frank was the best way to solve a problem. Of course, it required skills. There were things that could be said and could not be said, and the order of what was said first mattered. As an expert keyboard warrior, Klein was also good at sophistry. That is ridiculous. Do you think we are fools? Fitz Mountbatten could not help but interject angrily. This is such a bad lie that it insults the intelligence of his and his colleagues. It's better for you to pretend to be mentally ill than to pretend to be an amnesiac. I'm speaking the truth, Klein responded frankly, looking into the eyes of Mountbatten and middle-aged police inspectors. It really could not be more true. Maybe it is, the gray-eyed police inspector said slowly. What? He really believed it. Klein was surprised himself. The gray-eyed inspector smiled at him and said, an expert will come in 2 days and believe me, she should be able to help you to recall your lost memories. Expert. Help me remember my memories. In the field of psychology. Klein frowned. Hey, what if his memories of Earth were exposed? He suddenly felt like face-palming himself. The young police inspector put down his notes and searched his desk and room. Fortunately, he focused on books instead of lifting the kettle. Well, Mr. Klein, thank you for your cooperation. We advise that you'd better not leave Tingen for the coming days. If you have to, please notify Inspector Mountbatten, or you'll become a fugitive, the gray-eyed police inspector warned. That's it. That's it for today. No other questions with deeper investigations. Or taking me back to the police station to torture me for information. Klein was at a loss. Nevertheless, he wanted to solve the odd turn of events brought about by Welch too. So he nodded. That wouldn't be an issue. The inspectors exited the room one by one, and the young man at the end suddenly patted Klein on the shoulder. It's really nice. Very lucky. What? Klein's face was puzzled. The green-eyed police inspector with a poet's temperament smiled and said, generally speaking, the norm is for all the involved parties to die in such an event. We are very glad and fortunate to see you still alive. After that, he exited the room and closed the door behind him in well-mannered manner. The norm is for everyone to die together. Very glad that I'm still alive. Fortunate that I'm still alive. On this June afternoon, Klein was chilling all over. The norm is for everyone to die together. Very glad that I'm still alive. Fortunate that I'm still alive. Klein shivered and quickly ran to the door, trying to catch up with the policeman and ask for protection. But as soon as he reached the handle, he suddenly stopped. That officer talked so horribly about it, why didn't they protect me, an important witness or key lead? Isn't that too careless? Were they just probing me? Or maybe it's a bait. All kinds of thoughts rushed into Klein's mind. He suspected that the police were still secretly watching him, observing his reaction. He felt much calmer after thinking of this and was no longer so panicked. He slowly opened the door, deliberately shouting with a trembling voice at the staircase, "You guys will protect me, right?" Tap, tap, tap. There was no response from the police officers, and there was no change in the rhythm of the contact between the leather shoes and the wooden stairs. I know. You'll do that. Klein shouted again in a tone of feigned conviction, trying to act like a normal person that was in danger. The sound of footsteps gradually weakened and disappeared into the bottom floor of the apartment. Klein snorted and laughed. Isn't that response too fake? Their acting skills are not up to standard. He did not run after them. Instead, he turned back to the room and closed the door behind him. In the next few hours, Klein fully expressed what they called back in Foodaholic Empire, China, restlessness, nervousness, agitation, inadvertence, and murmuring words that he did not understand. He did not slack just because there was no one around. This is called the self-cultivation of an actor. He laughed at himself in his heart. When the sun moved to the west, the clouds on the horizon appeared to be reddish-orange. Tenants in the apartment came home one after another. Klein shifted his focus elsewhere. Melissa is almost done with school. He looked at the stove, lifted the kettle, peeled off the coal and took out the revolver. Without pause or delay, he reached to the back of the board under the double-decked bed where more than 10 wooden strips were staggered out. After clipping the left wheel between a piece of wooden strip and board, Klein straightened up and waited uneasily, fearing that the police would burst open the door and rush into the room with guns in their hands. If it was an age of steam, he was certain he would not be seen by anyone when he did that. However, there were extraordinary powers here, ones that he had proven through his own experiences. After waiting for a few minutes, there was no movement at the door. There was only the chatter between two tenants who were heading for the heart of the Wild Bar on Iron Cross Street. Phew. Klein exhaled, feeling assured. All he needed to do was wait for Melissa's return and cook the stewed mutton with tender peas. When the idea came to Klein's mind, his mouth seemed to taste the rich flavor of the gravy. He remembered how Melissa cooked stewed mutton with tender peas. First, she boiled the water and stir-fried the meat. Then, she added onions, salt, a little pepper, and water. After a specific period of time, the peas and potatoes were added, and the stew was to be cooked for an additional 40 or 50 minutes with the lid on. It's indeed a simple and crude way to do it, supported purely by the flavors of the meat itself. Klein shook his head. But there was no other way about it. It was hard for commoners to have many kinds of condiments and various cooking methods. They could only pursue simple, practical, and economical methods. As long as the meat was not burnt or spoiled, anything was good for people who could only eat meat once or twice a week. Klein was not a very good cook himself and ordered takeout food most of the time. But by cooking 3 or 4 times a week, after many weeks of accumulated practice, he had a passing standard and felt that he would not let the pound of mutton down. When Melissa comes back to cook it, it will be done after 7:30 p.m. She would be starving by then. It's time for her to see what real cooking is. Klein made an excuse for himself. First, he started the fire again, went to the bathroom to collect water, and washed the mutton. Then he took out the kitchen boards and knives before chopping the mutton into tiny chunks. As for the explanation for his sudden culinary skills, he decided to blame it on the dead Welch McGovern, who had not only hired a chef who was good at the mid-seashore flavor, but also often created his own delicacies and invited people to try them. Well, the dead cannot refute me. Nevertheless, TSK, this is a world with beyonders. The dead are not necessarily unable to speak. With that in mind, Klein was a little guilty conscience. He threw aside his confused thoughts and put the meat into the soup bowl. Then he took out the condiment box and added in a spoonful of the crude salt, half of which had begun yellowing. In addition, he cautiously took some black pepper grains from a special small bottle, mixing and marinating them together. He placed the saucepan on the stove and, while waiting for it to heat up, Klein rummaged for the carrots from yesterday and cut them into pieces with the onions he bought today. When he was done with his preparations, he took out a small can from the cupboard and opened it. There was not much lard left in it. Klein took a spoonful, put it in the pan, and melted it. He added in the carrots and onions and stirred it for a while. As the fragrance began to pervade, Klein poured all the mutton into the pot and fried it with care for a while. He should have added cooking wine in the process, or red wine at least. However, the Moretti family did not have these luxuries and could only drink a glass of beer a week. Klein had to make do with whatever was available and poured in some boiled water. After stewing for about 20 minutes, he opened the lid, put the tender peas and cut potatoes in it, and added a cup of hot water and 2 spoons of salt. He closed the lid, lowered the fire, and exhaled satisfactorily, waiting for his sister to reach home. As seconds turned into minutes, the fragrance in the room intensified. There was the allure from the meat, the rich smell of potatoes, and the refreshing scent of onions. The smell gradually mixed up, and Klein swallowed his saliva from time to time, keeping track of the time with his pocket watch. After more than 40 minutes, some not so brisk but rhythmic footsteps approached. A key was inserted, the handle was turned, and the door opened. Before Melissa came in, she whispered doubtfully, "Smells good." With her bag still in her hand, she stepped in and glanced over at the stove. "You made this." Melissa took off her fail hat and her hand paused mid-air, looking at Klein in astonishment. She twitched her nose and inhaled more of the fragrance. Her eyes quickly softened, and she seemed to find some confidence. "You made this?" she asked again. "Are you afraid I'd waste the mutton?" Klein smiled and returned with a question. Without waiting for an answer, he said to himself, "Don't worry, I specifically asked Welch to teach me how to cook this dish. You know, he has a good cook." First time. Melissa's eyebrows creased subconsciously, but they were smoothed by the fragrance. "It looks like I'm talented." Klein laughed. "It's almost done. Put your books and fail hat down somewhere. Go to the bathroom and wash your hands, and then get ready to taste it. I'm very confident about it." When she heard her brother's orderly arrangements and saw his gentle and calm smile, Melissa stood rooted at the door and failed to respond in her daze. "Do you prefer the mutton to be cooked longer?" Klein urged with a laugh. "Ah, okay." Melissa jolted back to her senses. With handbag and fail in each hand, she rushed into the room quickly. When the lid of the saucepan was uncovered, a sudden blast of steam appeared before Klein's eyes. 2 pieces of rye bread were already placed to the side of the mutton and tender peas, allowing them to absorb the fragrance and heat to become soft. By the time Melissa had packed her items, washed her hands and face, and returned, a plate of stewed mutton with tender peas, potatoes, carrots and onions was already placed on the table. 2 pieces of rye bread, colored by a light dip into the gravy, were on their plates. "Come on, try it." Klein pointed to the wooden fork and spoon next to the plate. Melissa was still a little confused. She didn't refuse, she picked up a potato with her fork, put it into her mouth and bit it lightly. The taste of the starchy potato and gravy fragrance flooded her mouth. Her saliva secretion went crazy as she gobbled down the potato in a few mouthfuls. "Try the mutton." Klein gestured at the plate with his chin. He had tasted it just now and thought it was barely at a passing standard, but it was enough for a girl who was inexperienced with what the world had to offer. After all, she only ate meat occasionally. Melissa's eyes were filled with anticipation as she carefully forked some mutton. It was very tender and, as soon as it entered the mouth, nearly melted. The fragrance of the meat exploded in her mouth, filling it with delicious meat juices. It was an unprecedented feeling, and that made Melissa unable to stop eating. By the time she realized it, she had already eaten several pieces of the mutton. Klein, this was supposed to be prepared for you," Melissa blushed and stammered. "I'd nibbled some of the food just now. It's the privilege of being a cook." Klein smiled and soothed her sister. He picked up his fork and spoon. At times, he would eat a piece of meat and sometimes, he would stuff his mouth full of peas. At other times, he would put down the utensils, break off a piece of rye bread and dip it in gravy. Melissa relaxed and was immersed in the delicacy again by Klein's normal behavior. "It's really delicious. It doesn't seem like you were doing it for the first time." Melissa looked at the empty dish and praised him with all her heart. Even the gravy was finished. "It's a long way from Welch's chef. When I'm rich, I'll take you and Benson out to the restaurant and have a better meal," Klein said. He was beginning to look forward to it himself. "Your interview," burp. Melissa did not finish her words because she suddenly let out a sound of contentment involuntarily. She put her hand over her mouth in a hurry and looked embarrassed. "The fault is with the stewed mutton with tender peas just now. It was just too delicious." Klein laughed secretly and decided not to make fun of his sister. He pointed to the plate and said, "This is your mission." "All right." Melissa stood up immediately, took the basin and rushed out the door. When she came back, she opened the cupboard to check the condiment box and other items as per normal. "Did you just use them?" Melissa was surprised and turned to Klein, holding the black pepper bottle and lard can. Klein shrugged his shoulders and laughed. "Just a little. It's the price of a delicacy." Melissa's eyes twinkled, her expression changing for a few moments before she finally said, "Let me cook in the future." You have to hurry up and prepare for the interview. You have to think about your job." "Melissa, can you not rub my nose in it?" Klein muttered inwardly. He felt a throbbing pain in his head. The amount of content Klein had forgotten was considered a lot, but neither was it negligible. The interview was in 2 days, so how could he find the time to make up for it? Furthermore, he was involved in such strange paranormal activity, so how would it be possible that he would be in the mood to revise? Klein gave his sister a perfunctory response and began putting on the appearance of studying. Melissa moved a chair over to sit beside him. With light shining from the gas lamp, she began working on her assignments. The atmosphere was serene. When it was almost 11 o'clock, the siblings bade each other good night and went to bed. Knock. 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 Poundings on the door roused Klein from his dreams. He peered out of the window to see the first glimmer of dawn. In a daze, he flipped over and sat up. "Who is it? Look at the time now. Why didn't Melissa wake me up?" "It's me. Dunn Smith," a man with a deep voice outside the door replied. "Dunn Smith. Don't know him." Klein got off his bed and shook his head as he walked towards the door. He opened the door to see the gray-eyed police inspector whom he had met the day before standing in front of him. Alarmed, Klein asked, "Is there something wrong?" The policeman replied with a stern look, "We found a carriage driver. He testified that you had gone to Mr. Welch's place on the 27th, the day when Mr. Welch and Ms. Naya died. Furthermore, Mr. Welch was the one who paid for your transportation fees." Klein was startled. He did not feel a tinge of fear or guilt that one would expect from having his lies exposed. It was because he was not even lying. In fact, he was surprised by the evidence provided by Dunn Smith. On the 27th of June, the former Klein had indeed gone to Mr. Welch's place. On the night that he returned, he killed himself, the exact same way as Welch and Naya did. Klein gave a forced smile and said, "This is insufficient evidence." It does not directly prove that I am associated with the death of Welch and Naya. Honestly speaking, I'm also very curious about the whole incident. I want to know what exactly happened to my two poor friends. But, I really can't remember. In fact, I have almost completely forgotten what I had done on the 27th. You may find it hard to believe, but I fully relied on the diaries I had written to roughly make a guess that I had gone to Welch's place on the 27th. You sure have great mental fortitude, Dunsmith said while nodding. He showed not a trace of anger, nor was he smiling. You should be able to hear my sincerity. Klein looked him straight in the eye and said, I'm telling the truth. Of course, only part of it. Dunsmith did not give an immediate response. He swept his glance across the room before saying slowly, Mr. Welch lost a revolver. I guess I should be able to find it here. Right. Mr. Klein. Indeed, Klein finally understood where the revolver had come from. A thought flashed in his mind and he came to the final verdict in an instant. He raised his hands halfway and retreated, leaving a path open. Then, he signaled at the bunk bed with his chin. Behind the bedboard. He did not specifically mention that it was the bottom deck, as no one would normally hide things at the back of the bedboard on an upper deck. That would be too obvious for guests to notice at a glance. Dunsmith did not move forward. The corners of his mouth twitched as he asked, nothing to add on. Without hesitation, Klein replied, There is. Yesterday, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I realized I was laying on my desk with a revolver beside me. There was a bullet at the corner of the room. It was as if I had committed suicide. But due to a lack of experience of never having used a gun, or maybe I was too scared at the final moment, anyway, the bullet did not achieve the desired result. My head is still in its place. I am still alive now. And since then, I have lost some memories, including what I saw and did at Welch's place on the 27th. I'm not lying. I really can't remember. For the sake of being eliminated as a suspect. For the sake of getting rid of all these strange events surrounding him, Klein explained almost everything that had happened. Except the transmigration and gathering. Also, Klein was careful with his words, allowing every sentence to be amenable. Such as, not revealing the fact that the bullet had hit his brains, but only mentioning that it did not achieve the desired result, and that his head was still in its place. To others, these two statements might seem to convey the exact same ideas, but in reality they were like chalk and cheese. Dunsmith listened quietly, then said, This corresponds with what I had surmised. It also corresponds with the hidden logic of similar incidents in the past. Of course, I have no idea how you managed to survive. I'm glad you believe in me. I don't know how I survived either. Klein heaved a small sigh of relief. But Dunn threw out a conjunction. There is no use in me believing you. You are currently the prime suspect. You have to be confirmed by an expert that you have indeed forgotten what you went through, or that you indeed have nothing to do with the deaths of Mr. Welch and Miss Naya. He coughed, his expression becoming serious. Mr. Klein, I seek your cooperation on coming with me to the police station for the investigation. This should take roughly 2 to 3 days if it is confirmed that there are no issues with you. The expert is here. Klein asked blankly in return. Didn't they say it would take another 2 days? She came earlier than expected. Dunn turned sideways, signaling for Klein to leave. Allow me to leave a note, Klein requested. Benson was still away and Melissa had gone to school. He could only leave a note to inform them that he was involved in an incident associated with Welch so that they would not worry about him. Dunn nodded, barely minding. All right. Klein returned to the desk. As he searched for paper, he began thinking about what was about to occur. Honestly speaking, he did not wish to meet the expert. After all, he had a bigger secret. In a place where there were 7 major churches, under the premise that Emperor Roselle, who was suspected to be a transmigrator predecessor, was assassinated, a thing like transmigration usually meant having to go to court and enter arbitration. But, without weapons, combat skills, or superpowers, he was no match for a professional policeman. What's more, a few of Dunn's subordinates were standing in the dark outside. Once they draw their guns and shoot at me, I'd be finished. Ugh, I'll take one step at a time. Klein left the note, grabbed his keys, and followed Dunn out the room. Along the dark aisle, 4 policemen in black and white checkered uniforms split into pairs and guarded them on both sides. They were very alert. Tap. 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 Klein followed alongside Dunn as they went down the wooden stairs which occasionally creaked in protest. Outside the apartment, there was a 4-wheeled carriage. On the side of the carriage, there was the 2 cross swords and a Crown Police emblem. Their surroundings were crowded and bustling with noise as usual. Go on. Dunn signaled for Klein to go first. Klein was just about to step forward when an oyster seller suddenly grabbed a customer and claimed that he was a thief. Both parties wrestled and triggered a response from the horses, causing great chaos. An opportunity. There wasn't much time for Klein to think any further. He bent forward and dashed towards the crowd. Either shoving or dodging, he escaped frantically towards the other end of the street. Right now, for the sake of not meeting the expert, he could only proceed by going to the pier outside the city, taking a boat down the Tussock River and escaping to the capital, Backland. The population was higher there, making it easier to hide. Of course, he could also get on a steam train, go eastward to the nearest Enmad harbor and take the sea route to Pritz, then towards Backland. Not long after, Klein arrived at a street and made a turn onto Iron Cross Street. There were several carriages that could be hired. To the pier outside the city. Klein reached out his hand and hopped onto one of the carriages. He had thought through things clearly. Firstly, he had to mislead the police that were coming for him. Once the carriage was a suitable distance away from them, he would jump right off. Alrighty. The carriage driver tugged at the reins. Clop. Clop. Clop, the carriage left Iron Cross Street. Just as Klein was about to jump off the carriage, he noticed that it had turned into another road. It wasn't leading out of the city. Where are you going? Klein blurted in his momentary daze. To Welch's place, the carriage driver answered monotonously. What? Klein was at a loss for words. The carriage driver turned around, exposing his cold gray eyes. It was Dunn Smith, the gray-eyed policeman. You. Klein was flustered. Everything suddenly became a blur as though the world spun around him when he instantly sat up. Sat up. Klein looked around, confused. He noticed the crimson moon outside the window and the room being covered in a crimson veil. He reached out with his hand to feel his forehead. It was all moist and cold. Cold sweat. His back felt exactly the same. It was a nightmare. Klein heaved a sigh. All is well, all is well. He found it weird. He was rather clear-minded in his dream, he was even able to think calmly. After calming down, Klein looked at his pocket watch. It was only 2 in the morning. He got out of bed quietly and planned to head to the washroom where he could wash his face and empty his burgeoning bladder. He opened the door and walked along the dark corridor. Under the dim moonlight, he walked lightly towards the washroom. Suddenly, he noticed a silhouette outside the window at the end of the corridor. That silhouette was wearing a black windbreaker that was shorter than a coat, but longer than a jacket. That silhouette was partly camouflaged in the darkness, bathing in the crimson moonlight. That silhouette turned around slowly. His eyes deep, gray, and cold. Dunn Smith. Plop. Klein could not help but take a step back. For a moment he was unsure if he was awake or still in his dreams. The silhouette took off his black top hat and bowed a little as he said with a smile, reintroducing myself, Nighthawk, Dunn Smith. Nighthawk. One of the code names of the Church of the Evernight Goddess beyond her teams which Justice and the Hanged Man mentioned before. Klein suddenly realized something, and exclaimed after making a connection, you can control dreams. You just made me dream of that. Nighthawk Dunn Smith wore his black hat again, concealing his slightly high hairline. With deep gray eyes he said, no, I only entered your dream and made the necessary guidance. His voice was deep and soothing, it reverberated through the dimly lit corridor without disturbing the sweet dreams of others. In dreams, even though much of your usually suppressed emotions and various dark thoughts in you are amplified, making everything seem chaotic, absurd, and crazy, they are all rooted in reality since reality exists. For veterans like me, everything is crystal clear. Compared to a conscious you, I believe the you in your dreams more. What normal human being could control his dream? If I had dreamed of something on Earth, wouldn't Dunn Smith have noticed? Klein was petrified by what had happened in the dream. Yet he quickly found it bizarre. He remembered being very much sober and rational, knowing what to say and what not to say. To put it simply, it did not feel like dreaming at all. So, Dunn Smith only saw what I wanted him to see. Klein's mind whirled as he gained a glimmer of understanding. This is a perk that resulted from transmigration. Like having a special body and soul. Or was it the effects of that luck enhancement ritual? So, Mr. Smith, do you believe that I really lost my memory? Klein organized his thoughts and asked in reply. Dunn Smith did not answer him directly. Instead he looked at him keenly. You are actually not surprised by the course of events. I've met people who wouldn't believe in the power of the Beyonders, and they would rather believe that they haven't really woken up. Klein tersely acknowledged as he said, perhaps, I have always been praying, hoping that there was such power to help me. An interesting train of thought, perhaps you survived not only because you were lucky. Dunn nodded expressionlessly. I can now confirm that you really lost parts of your memories due to the incident, especially those related to it. So can I go back now? Klein heaved a long sigh of relief in his heart as he probed. Dunn placed a hand in his pocket and walked slowly towards Klein, the surrounding darkness becoming tranquil and gentle. No, you still have to come with me to see the expert, he smiled politely and said. Why? Klein blurted out, then added, you don't believe in the findings from my dream. You must be joking. If that expert specializes in hypnosis or mind reading and stuff, then wouldn't my biggest secret be exposed? The consequences would be beyond imagination. I'm quite humble usually, but I'm still confident for things related to dreams. Dunn calmly replied, however, for important key matters, there is no harm in confirming them again. Plus, our specialties lie in different areas. Perhaps she can help you recover some of your memories. Not waiting for Klein to reply, his voice turned deeper. After all, you're connected to the whereabouts of that Antigonus family notebook. What? Klein froze. Dunn stopped in front of him, locking his gray eyes on Klein's eyes and said, at the scene of the suicide, there was not a single trace of that notebook from the fourth epoch. Welch is dead, Naya's dead, you are our only lead. All right then. Klein went silent for a moment before exhaling. A missing notebook, now this is really peculiar. How did I not think about the whereabouts of that notebook from the fourth epoch? Dunn nodded slightly, walking past Klein and said, lock your door and come with me to Welch's apartment, the expert is waiting for us there. Klein took in a silent breath. His heart was thumping wildly as he felt uneasy. He wanted to decline and even had the intention to run. However, he believed that with what had happened in his dreams, Dunn Smith would have definitely heightened his level of guard. And with the difference in strength between a normal human and a beyonder, there was little chance of success by using force. He must have a revolver with him too, he must also have had practice using the revolver. Many thoughts flashed past his mind, and eventually Klein chose to accept the reality. All right. Sigh, I can only take one step at a time and see how things unfold, maybe, that miraculous power in my dream will take effect again. Then let's go, Dunn said in an indifferent tone. Klein turned and followed. After taking 2 steps, he suddenly stopped and said, Mr. Smith, I would like to use the bathroom first. I came out originally for the bathroom. Dunn did not stop him. Instead, he gave him a keen look and said, no problem, Klein. Believe me, I am far more powerful than you can imagine in the dark night. In the dark night, Klein silently repeated this phrase. He did not make any reckless attempt to escape and honestly relieved himself. He then washed his face with cold water, completely calming himself down. Klein changed his outfit and closed the door to his apartment. With gentle steps, Klein followed Dunn down the stairs and walked towards the building's entrance. In such a tranquil setting, Dunn Smith opened his mouth and spoke suddenly, at the end of the dream, why did you try to escape? What were you afraid of? Klein immediately thought of an answer as he said, I do not remember what I did at Welch's place, nor do I remember if I was directly involved in Welch's and Naya's deaths. I was afraid that if it was really proven to be my doing, I would rather gamble and escape. I can then start anew in the southern continent. I would have done the same if I were you, Dunn said as he pushed open the door to the building, letting in the cool midnight breeze to disperse the sweltering heat inside. He was not afraid of Klein running away as he got on the carriage. It was exactly the one Klein had dreamed of, a 4-wheeled carriage drawn by a single horse and the carriage driver. There was also the police emblem of double-crossed swords that clustered a crown carved onto the side of the carriage. Klein followed into the carriage. Inside, there was a thick carpet laid out and the place was filled with a soothing fragrance. Having sat down, he looked for a topic to probe for more information. Mr. Smith, what if, and I mean if, the expert confirms that I have really forgotten a part of my memories? And that there is no other evidence which points to me being the perpetrator or a victim, would this be over? In theory, yes. We will try to search for the notebook through other means. As long as it exists, it can be found. Of course, before that, we will have to make sure you are not cursed or have any scent of cacodemons and that there are no related psychological problems lingering. We must ensure that you can embrace the rest of your life peacefully and healthily. Dunn Smith had a smile on his face, a rather unusual smile. Klein caught on to this point keenly, and promptly inquired, in theory. Yes, only in theory. In this field of work, there are always twisted, unorthodox, and inexplicable things happening. Dunn looked Klein in the eye and said, their continuation or end are not what we can foresee or control at times. For example, Klein actually felt frightened for a moment. The carriage sped through an almost empty street. Dunn took out his tobacco pipe and sniffed it, saying, "When we believe that things have come to an end, with everything going back to normal, it would resurface in a terrifying, chilling way. A few years ago, we handled a case regarding an evil cult. They did live sacrifices to please an evil god by making followers commit suicide. When one of the followers was chosen, his survival instincts triumphed over his foolishness, twisted beliefs, and psychedelic drugs. He secretly escaped and reported to the police. The case was handed over to us. It was a very small mission, since there were no Beyonders in that cult. The deity they worshipped was actually randomly thought up by their leader merely for the sake of money and satisfaction. Humanity was lost there. We only used 2 members, coupled with the support from the police, to suppress this cult. No one was off the hook. For that whistleblower, we also confirmed that he had no lingering demonic scent left on him. He was not cursed and did not suffer any mental disorders. He didn't have any personality problems or any other irregularities, nothing. Later, he got a decent advancement in his career, got married to a very good wife, had a son and a daughter. His dark past seemed far away from him. The horror and bloodshed seemed to have completely vanished. At this point, Dunn Smith gave out a laugh and said, "Yet in March this year, despite being in good financial health and having a loving wife and adorable kids, he strangled himself to death in his own office." The crimson moonlight outside the carriage window shone upon Dunn Smith. At that instant, his seemingly self-derisive smile made Klein feel unspeakably horrified. Strangled himself to death, Klein drew in a gasp of cool air silently, as if seeing his own tragic end. "Even if I escaped it once, it might just be temporary. Is there any way to resolve this completely? Become a Beyonder to fight it?" The carriage returned to silence. Countless thoughts welled in Klein's mind. Under an awkward silence, the carriage traveled for a long time at high speeds. Just as Klein made up his mind to consult Dunn Smith for any solutions, the carriage came to a halt. "Mr. Smith, we have reached Welch's apartment." The carriage driver's voice was heard. "Let's get down." Dunn straightened out his black coat that reached his knees. "Oh, let me introduce beforehand, the official disguise of the expert is the most renowned spirit medium of Awa County." Klein suppressed his other thoughts and asked curiously, "Then what is her actual identity?" Dunn half turned his body and turned his head back. With his abstruse gray eyes he said, "A true spirit medium." A true medium, Klein repeated this description inwardly, and did not speak again. He followed Dunn Smith down the carriage. Welch's place in Tingen was a detached house with a garden. The road outside the hollowed metal gates allowed 4 carriages to pass through at once. Street lamps lined the sides of the road every 50 meters. They looked different from the ones Klein had seen in his previous life. They were gas lamps and the height of every lamp was about that of an adult male so that it was convenient to light the lamps. The black metal was closely pressed to the glass, forming a checkered pattern, casting out classical paper lantern-like artworks. Coldness and warmth were intertwined while darkness and light coexisted. Walking along the pathway blanketed by rays from the sunset, Klein and Dunn Smith entered Welch's rented place through the ajar metal gate. Facing the main entrance was a cemented road that led straight to a 2-floored bungalow. 2 carriages could go at once. There was a garden on the left and a lawn to the right. The pleasantly faint fragrance from the flowers mixed with the cool scent of the fresh grass made one feel happy and relaxed. As soon as he stepped in, Klein shivered and peered around. He felt that in the garden, somewhere in the lawn, on the roof, behind the swing, somewhere in a dark corner, pairs of eyes were observing him. There was clearly no one here, yet, Klein felt as if he was on a crowded street. This strange contrast, this peculiar feeling, tensed him up. A chill ran up his spine. "Something's wrong." He couldn't help but exclaim to Dunn. Dunn's expression remained unchanged as he walked beside him and replied calmly, "Just ignore them." Since the Nighthawk had said so, Klein tolerated the chilling feeling of not being able to notice the perpetrator despite being followed, spied, and observed. Step by step, he arrived at the main entrance of the bungalow. "If this goes on any longer, I will go crazy." As Dunn reached out his hand to knock on the door, Klein quickly turned around. Flowers swayed in the wind, without a person in sight. "Come in, gentlemen." A seemingly ethereal voice came from inside the house. Dunn turned the doorknob, pushed the door open and said to a woman on the sofa, "Daly, any results?" The chandelier in the living room was unlit. A set of 2 leather couches surrounded a marble coffee table. On the table was a lit candle, but the light emitted a cobalt blue glow. It covered the half-enclosed living room, dining room, and kitchen in a strange, eerie hue. On the middle of the sofa sat a lady in a hooded black robe who wore blue eyeshadow and blush. An exposed Silevler bracelet with a hanging white crystal pendant was worn around her wrist. At the first sight of her, Klein had an inexplicable feeling. She was dressed just like a real medium. Was she stereotyping herself? Daly, the medium with uncanny beauty, took a quick glance at Klein with her twinkling emerald eyes. She looked at Dunsmith and said, "The original spirits have all disappeared, including that of Welch's and Naya's. Right now, all these little rascals know nothing at all." Spirits. Spirit medium, all the invisible things that were spying on him previously were spirits. There were so many of them. Klein removed his hat and placed it across his chest, bowing slightly as he said, "Good evening, madam." Dunsmith sighed. "That's tricky. Daly, this is Klein Moretti. See if you can get anything out of him." The medium Daly shifted her gaze onto Klein immediately. She pointed at a single armchair and said, "Please, take a seat." "Thank you." Klein nodded, took a few steps over, and sat down obediently. His heart raced uncontrollably. Whether I survive, whether I get through this successfully or have my secrets exposed will all depend on whatever happens next. And the thing that made him feel the most helpless was that he had nothing to rely on. He could only place his hopes on his inherent specialness. This feeling really sucks, Klein thought bitterly. Next, Dunn sat on the two-seater sofa opposite of Klein. Daly took out 2 thumb-sized glass bottles from her waist pouch. Her emerald eyes smiled at Klein as she said, "I need a bit of help here. After all, you are not an enemy. I can't treat you harshly. That might make you uncomfortable or put you in pain. It might even leave some serious after effects on you. I will give you some fragrances, making you feel tender and smooth, which will allow you to let loose bit by bit so that you can truly indulge in those feelings." That sounded wrong, Klein gaped as his eyes were filled with shock. Seated across him, Dunn laughed and said, "Don't be weirded out. We are different from the fellows from the Church of the Lord of Storms. Here, the ladies can also verbally tease men. In this regard, you should be able to understand. Your mother was a devout believer of the goddess. You and your brother used to attend Sunday school at church. I understand. It's just that I never thought that she would be such a, Klein gestured as he could not find the right words. He almost blurted out the direct translation for veteran driver. Dunn curved the corners of his mouth up and said, "Don't worry. Actually, Daly seldom does this. She just wants to use these methods to calm you down. She prefers corpses over men." "You make me sound perverted," Daly interjected with a smile. She opened one of the little bottles and dripped a few drops onto the bright blue candle flame. Night vanilla, slumber flower and chamomile, all distilled and extracted to form this aromatic floral essence. I call it amantha. It means tranquility in the Hermes language. It smells really amazing. As they chatted, the candle flame flickered, evaporating the floral essence and filling the room with its aroma. A beautifully enchanting aroma found its way into Klein's nostrils. He no longer felt tensed up. He was instantly calm as if he was gazing into the darkness of the silent night. This bottle is called the Eye of the Spirit. Barks and leaves of drago and poplar trees are sun-dried for 7 days and decocted thrice. Then, they are immersed in Lanti wine. Of course, there would be several incantations while we're at it. As Daly described the liquid, the amber substance dripped onto the cobalt blue candle flame. Upon smelling the ethereal scent of the aromatic wine, Klein noticed that the candle flame was dancing wildly. The luster of Daly's blue eyeshadow and blush shone oddly, to the extent of him seeing double. It is a great helping hand for mediumship. It is also a floral essence that is sufficiently enchanting. As Daly explained continuously, Klein felt as if her voice was coming from all around. Bewildered, Klein looked around and realized that everything was swaying and in a blur. He felt like he was shrouded by layers and layers of fog. Even his body was swaying as it phased away before he began floating and then losing his balance. Colors blended like an impressionist painting. The reds were redder, the blues were bluer, and the blacks were blacker, appearing more defined than usual. It was dreamy and hazy. Distinct murmurs from the surroundings came through as if hundreds and thousands of people who could not be seen were debating. This feels similar to the luck enhancement ritual I did before, but without the kind of madness that makes your head feel like exploding. Klein looked around and thought questioningly. At this moment, his vision was locked onto a pair of eyes that were crystal clear like emerald. On a blurry sofa sat Daly in a black robe. Eccentrically, her gaze concentrated on the tip of Klein's head. She smiled and in a gentle voice, said, "Let me properly introduce myself. I am the spirit medium Daly. I can still have rational thoughts. It's like when I was at that luck enhancement ritual in that gathering." The thought crossed Klein's mind as he intentionally behaved muddled and said, "Hello there." The mental worlds of humans are extremely vast. Many secrets are hidden within the mind. Look at the ocean. What we know about it is all on the superficial level. But in reality, deep in the ocean, there is a larger unseen portion. Other than islands, there is the entire ocean. There is the boundless sky that symbolizes the spiritual world. You are the spirit of your body. Not only do you know of the islands above, but you also know of the things hidden beneath the sea, as well as the entire ocean. Anything that exists leaves some traces behind. The superficial memories of the islands may be wiped out, but what is left under the sea and the entire ocean will definitely have a corresponding projection left in it. Daly went on and on, bewitching Klein. The vague surrounding winds and shadows took on similar forms. It as though Klein's spirit was fully exposed in the form of an ocean, waiting for him to search and discover. Klein watched patiently as he churned the ocean occasionally. Then, in an airy voice, he replied, "No, I can't remember, I have forgotten." He expressed his agony at just the right level. Daly tried to guide him once again, but the clear-headed Klein was unaffected. "Okay. We shall end here. You may leave. Leave. Leave." The airy voice lingered and Daly disappeared. The wind and shadows began calming as the ethereal smell and subtle scent of the aromatic wine became more distinct again. The colors returned to their normal state and the fuzzy feeling was no longer around. Klein's body quivered, and he found his balance again. He opened his eyes, which he had no memory of closing, and noticed that the candle with the bright blue flame was still before him. Dunsmith was still resting comfortably on the couch. Same for Daly with the black hooded robe. "Why did you use the theory that belongs to that bunch of evil madmen, the psychology alchemists?" Dunn furrowed his eyebrows and stared at Daly. As Daly put away the 2 little bottles, she replied calmly, "I think it's pretty accurate. At least, it corresponds with some of the things I've made contact with before." Without waiting for Dunn's reply, Daly shrugged and said, "This tricky fellow did not leave a single trace behind." Upon hearing this, Klein heaved a huge sigh of relief. Pretentiously, he asked, "Oh, it's over. What happened?" "It felt like I just took a nap." "That was a pass, right?" "Thankfully, I had the luck enhancement ritual as a rehearsal." "Just take it as such." Dunn interrupted him and looked at Daly. "Have you examined Welch's and Naya's bodies? The corpses can tell us a lot more than you can imagine. It's such a pity that Welch and Naya had indeed committed suicide. So, the force that drove them to it is to be feared. Not a single trace was left behind." Daly stood up and pointed at the candle. "I need some rest." The cobalt blue glow vanished, and the house was instantly inundated with a blurry shade of crimson. "Congratulations. You can return home now. But do remember, do not reveal this incident to your loved ones. You have to promise this," Dunn said as he led Klein to the door. Surprised, Klein asked, "Is there no need to examine the curses or the trails left behind by the evil spirits?" Daly didn't mention anything about it, so there's no need for it, Dunn answered simply. Klein calmed down. As the thought of his previous worries came to mind, he asked hurriedly, "How can I be sure that I will be free from trouble from now on?" "No worries." Dunn twitched his lips and said, "Based on statistics of similar incidents in the past, 80% of the survivors of the incident do not experience any horrifying after effects. Yeah, this is based on what I know, roughly, more or less. Then, there's still 1/5 of those poor souls." Klein did not dare to try his luck. "Then you can consider joining us as a civilian staff. This way, even if there are any precursors, we can discover it in time," Dunn said casually as he approached the carriage. "Or simply become a beyonder. After all, we are not nannies. We can't babysit you all day long and even watch what you do with women." "Can I?" Klein questioned the statement. Of course, he did not expect much. After all, how was it even possible to be a part of the Nighthawk so easily and obtain the power of the Beyonders? That was the power of the Beyonders. Dunn paused and turned his head sideways to look at him. "It's not that you can't, it depends." "What?" The transition in his words shocked Klein. Klein stared blankly beside the carriage before answering, "Really? Who are you kidding? Is it so easy to become a Beyonder?" Dunn laughed lightly, his gray eyes were hidden in the shadow of the carriage. "You don't believe me, huh? Actually, when you become a Nighthawk you lose a lot. For instance, freedom. Even if we don't talk about this now, there is another issue. Firstly, you are not a member of the clergy, nor a devotee. You can't pick whatever you want or choose the safest approach. And secondly," Dunn held onto the handle and hopped onto the carriage as he went on. "Among the cases that we, us, the mandated punisher, the machinery hive mind and other judiciaries, have to deal with annually, a quarter of them were a result of Beyonders who lost control." A quarter Beyonders who lost control? Klein was dumbfounded. Just then, Dunn turned slightly. His gray eyes were deep. With no sign of a smile, he continued, "And among the quarter of cases, a large number of them are our teammates. Like and subscribe.